and welcome to the second of 5 parts of this exploration of collective bargaining and looking at negotiations in the modern workplace. And just start by doing a bit of a review of what we covered last time, which was essentially a definition of what collective bargaining actually means. Some of the preconceptions around it, particularly in relation to industrial action and things like strikes, etc., and some of the history and how we've ended up with the modern collective bargaining culture that we have. This time, what I'd like to have a look at is the language around collective bargaining and the vocabulary that's used, and some of the things that actually mean subtly different to what they actually sound like they should mean. So I'll just start by looking at some of the basic terminology. I think the first one to look at is union recognition. It's a term that you might well have come across, or I suppose you might not have, but effectively this is when an employer recognises that a union or a group of unions represent the views of the staff and will therefore be the body who can negotiate on behalf of that staff for changes to terms and conditions or health and safety issues, etc. So effectively it is a recognition of the collective voice. The terms information and consultation have taken on various different meanings over the years, but have become much tighter defined since the information and consultation of employees regulations came in, implementing a European Union directive that was all about that. And there's been a fair amount of case law in relation to them ever since. One of the common things that you might well have come across if you've been watching the news in relation to industrial relations disputes and the like, is you'll get the union on and they'll be sort of saying, this is terrible, they've not even consulted us. And in the next breath you'll have the management saying, what are they talking about? Of course we consulted them, we told them the information ages ago. Now, what's the problem there? Well, it essentially is rooted in the fact that they're using different definitions of the term consult. Information is when you tell something to somebody else. So in this case, the employer would tell their staff that something is going to happen. When it becomes consultation, the implication there that's been tested by law is that the information will be provided in such a way that the views of those staff can be reflected back and taken into account in the final decision as to what actually happens. And that's where the breakdown quite often comes, that you end up seeing reported. ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, have a very defined view on information and consultation. It's not rooted in the regulations, and it's not rooted in the directive from the EU, but it's based on some of the research that they've done on what the benefits of providing information and undertaking genuine consultation with your staff actually are. And so they have a whole range of reasons why it's actually a good thing. So basically it can improve organisational performance, so your business will actually improve, potentially become more profitable. Because the consultation process means that there is information and knowledge from the staff that's being passed back up to management, their performance in leading the organisation and actually making decisions becomes better, more accurate, better informed. At the same time, the employees feel more valued, feel more part of the company, and that means that they become more committed and actually perform their jobs better as well. As a spin-off from all of that, the levels of trust between staff and their employer and their direct managers will actually start to improve as well. And that leads to an overall increase in job satisfaction, which is where some of the things in relation to performance come from. And of course, flowing from that, the more satisfied that people are at work, generally the balance between their home life and their work life becomes much easier for them to manage and becomes much better. So returning to the basic terminology, the next one you come to from this line is negotiation. But so what does negotiation mean? Well, it kind of depends on the context in which which you're negotiating. Because if you have a good flow of information and a consultative approach, then it could be a very different negotiation than if there isn't this poor flow of information and very little consultation ongoing. And of course, that's where you get into some of the different models, such as the growing use of partnerships or collaborative models for negotiation and interaction with staff and management. So yes, there could be movable feast in terms of meanings there. So it's worth having a look at some of the phrases that people use when they're actually getting involved in these negotiations. So I'll just run through a few of those now. The term sides, I referred to that in the first presentation that I did, and the origin of it actually comes from the Whitley Council model, the one that John Whitley developed back in 1917, where he proposed that there was a formal sitting down of the management side and the staff side to actually discuss the issues that were of interest and need for both parties to actually improve the organisation. And you'll very often hear the term sides still being used, even though it sounds a bit confrontational and some people don't like it, but actually it can be a very useful shorthand to work out which party is actually speaking at which time. You'll have heard the term claim, no doubt, if you've been following any of the news about these things. And generally, the claim is something that a union or a collection of unions, depending on the industrial relations arrangement, will pull together, usually in relation to pay negotiations. It can be in relation to some other things as well, but it's usually to do with pay negotiations. So they will pull together a claim, and that may be very specific or it can be quite vague depending on what the tactics are going into that negotiation or what the scope is for actually negotiating. What you may not have heard so much is the term negotiating remit, but people involved in negotiations often use it. Now, it can apply to the union side as well, although their negotiating remit is usually set in the process of pulling together a well-informed and justifiable claim, so that kind of sets their negotiating remit. It's more commonly actually used as a term that I would apply to the management side, and effectively it's the scope that they've been given by whether it's the board or whether it's the government department that has responsibility for that organisation, or whatever organisation that oversees the finances of the company. And it's the scope that they actually have to negotiate. So they can go to a certain level. Beyond that, they're not allowed to go. Of course, they could seek further permissions, but it's a remit that is set within which they have to reach some kind of settlement. Recommendation is very often in news coverage about disputes, and it generally would relate to once the negotiation has taken place. Then the unions would decide whether or not they were going to recommend the claim to their members. And sometimes they can recommend the members accept, sometimes they will recommend that members reject, and sometimes they will say a different phrase, quite often this one, which is, this is the best offer that can be achieved through negotiation. Now, sounds relatively positive, and I've recently had an employer contact me saying that they were very surprised that the offer that they had made was rejected because the union had agreed that they would recommend it to their staff as the best that could be achieved through negotiation. Now, as a phrase, what's in the background to that is the union negotiators are saying to their members, this is as far as we can go unless you are prepared to take some form of industrial action to strengthen our negotiating hand. So it's worth remembering that in the background of this, there is a delegation of responsibility to the members to actually say whether or not they're prepared to take action. And I've been involved in situations where I have recommended to members, this is the best that can be achieved through negotiation. And they've indicated that they would not be willing to take any kind of action, so therefore they would be well advised in those circumstances to vote in favour of whatever the offer was. Of course, if the membership doesn't vote in favour, you'll have heard the term impose, and impose is what management will generally look to do if they don't feel that they have any more scope within their negotiating remit, and they cannot reach agreement with the union. Of course, the term impose would usually be what the unions would describe that management are doing, because management would generally prefer to say that they are implementing the proposals. But either way, whether it's being imposed, whether it's being implemented, is generally something that is happening without agreement. And it's then up to the unions and the staff to decide whether or not they actually want to do something about that. What's happened a lot of times through the austerity years, where organisations in the public sector have had very limited scope to negotiate, and that's been acknowledged by or recognised by the unions, what they've quite often done is that when management have implemented, although the unions say, well, you've imposed this, they take a pragmatic decision not to take any kind of action on it because they appreciate that management have gone as far as they can go. So there's a whole range of things in the background to that term as well. Industrial dispute would be where there is a valid reason for staff and management to fall out with each other, whether it's because a pay claim isn't enough, or it could be failings in health and safety, or it could be not meeting some terms that have been agreed in a previous settlement. Either way, that can be registered as an industrial dispute, and it has to be a valid industrial dispute before a ballot can take place in terms of industrial action, or at least one that would be sustainable. A term I thought might be worth just resting on is the term tough negotiator. We heard that in the run-up to the Brexit negotiations, when there was a change in the lead negotiator and the government said they were bringing in a tough negotiator. Well, you can argue whether do you want a tough negotiator or do you want a smart negotiator, and I think that's something that you've touched on earlier in the course. And I thought this was quite a good illustration of what you could end up with if you take the line of tough negotiation as opposed to smart negotiation and get into that arm wrestling. So moving beyond the actual negotiation, there's a range of different terms that are used around dispute resolution as well. So for example, arbitration. And you might have come across the term. It's actually relatively unusual in terms of industrial relations, partly because arbitration involves getting an arbitrator, and they consider the cases that each side wants to present and then will determine on one side or the other. It comes in a couple of forms. One is binding, one is non-binding. And binding arbitration, effectively, whatever the arbitrator says will dictate to the two parties what the outcome will be. The non-binding one means that there's still some scope around the edges to make some changes, but actually arbitration as a whole is generally not something that many organisations or unions would like to actually agree to get into. Conciliation is a much more common approach, and that's generally the one that is offered by ACAS or the Labour Relations Agency. In terms of if there is an industrial dispute, then quite often they will come in and they will do a conciliation process. It's very similar to mediation, but it's quite often done on a shuttle basis, at least in the early stages, and it's obviously between groups and representatives of groups rather than with the individual parties themselves. ACAS, I said earlier, was the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, government agency that operates in Great Britain. The Labour Relations Agency is its equivalent in Northern Ireland, and it operates in a very similar way. There's also the Central Arbitration Committee, to whom various disputes would be referred, most usually when there's a dispute over whether or not a union has an absolute right to be recognised, but they will arbitrate on that. So just before I close off, I'm just wondering if I can maybe ask you to maybe have a think about where do those fit into the dispute resolution spectrum? Where does it all go in terms of resolving disputes between management and staff over different areas? And also have a consider, would you regard those as being part of the collective bargaining process? It's maybe worth having a think about. Anyway, look forward to speaking to you again.